Welcome to the Subway Escape game. The game will start in 10 minutes. Please do not make noise during the game announcement, otherwise, it will be treated as a violation. As soon as I stepped into the subway carriage, a cold mechanical sound rang in my ear. Welcome to the Subway Escape game. The game will start in 10 minutes. Please do not make noise during the announcement, otherwise, it will be treated as a violation. As soon as I stepped into the subway carriage, a cold mechanical sound rang in my ear. A passenger who was on the phone scolded discontentedly, who was playing their phone so loudly. Don't you have any manners? As soon as his words fell with a bang, his head exploded like fireworks. A blood-red flower slowly sprouted from the man's neck. At first, it was just a small bud. As the man's body gradually withered, the flower grew larger. When the flower finally bloomed, the man's body was completely drained. Flesh, skeleton, and organs all disappeared, as if they had all turned into nutrients, absorbed by the flower, leaving only a wrinkled skin. The crowd was quiet for a few seconds. Then there were bursts of screams, murder. They ran around, holding their heads. Some even slammed the subway door, wanting to escape, but it was in vain. I stood quietly in the corner, watching the screaming crowd turn into fireworks one after another. Then their flesh was sucked away by the red flowers. 1, 2, 3. The frequent fireworks made people even more panicked. The screams got louder. Some people took out their phones, wanting to call the police, but without exception, as soon as they made a sound at that moment, their lives came to an end. Finally, the surviving crowd remembered the content of the mechanical sound broadcast, hastily covered their mouths, shivering, not daring to make a sound. The carriage was filled with people lying in all directions. There was a human bag right in front of me. I moved my feet disgustedly. After a while, the mechanical sound rang again. It was still cold, but I inexplicably heard a tone of schadenfreude. The punishment of the violators has been completed, totaling 132 people. There are 36 players left. The number of remaining players is detected to be too few. They will be concentrated and merged into 3 carriages, 12 people per carriage. I was startled. In just a few minutes, more than 100 people had died. What was the origin of this mechanical sound? Was it a terrorist organization or hostile forces? How did it manage to kill so simply and quickly? This is really interesting. I blinked my eyes to cover up the excitement in my pupils. Just then, the lights in the carriage suddenly flickered a few times. After returning to normal, I was shocked to find that the corpses on the ground had disappeared. The ground and the windows were as clean as new, clean as if no one had ever died here. But there were more people in the carriage. The original number of survivors was 5. Now there were 12. It seemed that it was the carriage merger mentioned by the mechanical sound. The newcomers looked around in panic. Everyone had a lot of questions, but no one dared to speak. I didn't look at them, but turned to look at the big screen in the carriage. This screen was on the right side of the subway door. I remember it usually played some advertisements and public welfare content. Now it was pitch black, as if it had been turned off. But if you look closely, you can see the outline of a face. I stared at the screen, and suddenly a doll's face appeared inside. The doll's pupils were very large, almost occupying the entire eyeball, glowing with a scarlet light, looking very scary. The lips stretched to the sides and connected to the earlobes, revealing sharp white teeth with a slight movement. No, his teeth were not pure white. If you look closely, you would find that there were blood stains on them, and there were still remnants of meat between the teeth. Everyone was shocked by this scene. A high school girl took a breath of cold air and was about to scream subconsciously. The suit man next to her quickly covered her mouth and suppressed the sound in her throat. The girl came to her senses, suddenly feeling a wave of fear after the fact. Cold sweat broke out on her forehead, and she glanced at the man in the suit gratefully. Perhaps because it failed to scare the girl, the doll seemed a bit unhappy. Its mouth opened and closed as it spoke, and the mechanical voice was even colder. But what was disgusting was that as it spoke, the bits of meat stuck between its teeth kept falling out. I, with sharp eyes, noticed a piece of dark blue fabric mixed in with the meat remnants. If I remember correctly, the first male passenger whose head exploded like fireworks was wearing a dark blue shirt. A bad association crossed my mind. Could it be that those deceased passengers had become food for the doll? Without giving me time to think further, the doll had already started a new announcement. Attention all players, the first game is about to begin. The theme of the game is Silent Villagers. Game introduction. The sun has set and the monster is about to appear. But the idle villagers are still wandering outside and haven't returned home in time. The villagers need to escape from the monster's pursuit and return home safely in order to survive. Note that the monster has poor sight and no sense of smell, but its hearing is extremely sharp. Villagers must be careful and must not be discovered by the monster. Otherwise, with a laugh mixed with electric current, it sounded extremely eerie and terrifying. I looked around and found out that several passengers, or should I say players now, had turned pale. It was only after the doll had laughed enough that it spoke again. Now is the game preparation period. Players can freely discuss and communicate. Any behavior will not be punished. The game will officially begin in 5 minutes. After the electronic screen flashed a few times, the doll's face suddenly disappeared. In its place was a dark red 5-minute countdown. The crowd was in a commotion. Some people were crying with their faces covered. Some tried to call their families or the police, but despairingly found that they could not contact the outside world. There were also people who were rubbing their hands together, eager to try the upcoming game. Fortunately, no one fell into a panic and repeated the initial fireworks explosion. A word suddenly flashed in my mind: screening. The initial mass death, rather than being a punishment, was more like the doll's screening behavior. It was like randomly selecting a large number of people, and through a sudden terror event, eliminating the majority of qualified people, who would then enter the game screen. The countdown moved towards the last minute. Although there could be free communication between the players, this existence beyond cognition clearly deterred everyone. No one was in the mood to chat. Everyone stayed silently in their own positions, sitting or standing. Soon, the countdown turned to 0, and the face of the doll appeared on the screen again. This time, its tone was more excited. The first game, Silent Villagers, officially begins. All villagers, please use your wisdom to try to escape from the monster. There will be rewards for those who survive to the end. Accordingly, the failed villagers will be punished. As the doll's voice fell, I was suddenly plunged into darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was in a very primitive village. Under my feet were fields of rice paddies, and the sun was slowly setting in the distance, about to fold up its last rays of light. I was still wearing my own clothes, and my backpack and phone were still with me. The only thing that had changed was the environment I was in. It was as if I had been teleported to a strange place. After a glance around, I confirmed that all 12 players were there. The positions were the same as when we were on the subway. The only difference was that everyone was standing now. How beautiful! The girl next to the man in the suit looked at the distant mountains and couldn't help but murmur. I followed her gaze. The setting sun had dyed the clouds over the towering mountains with colors. It was indeed a sight rarely seen in the concrete city. Is this the time to be admiring the scenery? Someone grumbled discontentedly. It's just a game. There's no need to panic. Didn't that doll just say that the monster only has sharp hearing? When it appears, we just need to keep quiet. There definitely won't be anything wrong. The speaker was a young man in his early 20s, wearing a dreadlock hairstyle and dressed in a trendy, hip-hop style. He sneered at the person who had just spoken, his eyes full of mockery. I didn't say a word, but in my heart, I didn't agree with what he said. If it was really as simple as keeping quiet, then we had already experienced a round before the game started. There was no need to specifically set another game. There must be something different, or in other words, there must be a trap. The sun quickly set completely, and the afterglow faded. The night sky covered the entire village, which was silent except for us players. The night wind blew, making it extremely eerie, as if the beautiful scenery that had made people linger a moment ago was just a cruel dream. The man in the suit coughed and pointed into the distance. According to the game instructions, the monster should appear soon. Should we find a house to hide in first? Although it was a question, his tone was certain, with a hint of leadership. He obviously wanted to take control while everyone was still uncertain. Most people nodded in agreement. The man in the suit waved his hand and turned to walk towards the nearest house. But after taking only a few steps, he stopped as if he had hit a wall. But there was nothing in front of him, no obstruction at all. The man in the suit incredulously rubbed his head and reached out tremblingly to touch. Just about an arm's length away, he touched that non-existent wall. "What is this?" someone asked in horror. I watched them panicking, fumbling around like a bunch of dancing clowns. They really were stupid. Suddenly, there was a rumbling noise in the distance. Bang, 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 accompanied by a huge shadow. A 4-footed beast was slowly approaching here. Presumably, this was the monster mentioned by the doll. Everyone's face turned pale, and they became even more panicked, desperate to escape from here. But they always ran into the transparent wall. I furrowed my brows, not initially planning to help them. But once the monster came over, they would likely make a noise out of desperation, which could implicate me. "Stop looking. The subway doors didn't open. How are you going to get out?" The man in the suit turned his head to look at me, asking somewhat irritably, "What do you mean by that?" I didn't mind his rudeness and simply said, "Haven't you guys noticed yet? We are actually still on the subway. Everything we see in front of us is an illusion." The other players all looked doubtful, clearly not believing my words. The dreadlocked man even mocked, "Are you scared, silly? What nonsense are you talking about?" The man in the suit also folded his arms, looking as if I was talking in my sleep. "Mister, why do you make such a judgment?" I took 2 steps to the left, then sat down without hesitation. I also threw my backpack towards the 2 o'clock direction. Everyone's eyes widened. From the perspective of the others, both I and my backpack appeared to be suspended in the air, but in reality, I was sitting on the subway seat, and my backpack was wedged between the subway's double poles. This is the first trap in the game. We are still in the carriage, deceived by our vision to believe we are in the village. If the monster comes later and no one breaks the illusion, the players will definitely hit the subway doors or seats in the initial escape. They may even trip and scream in panic. The consequence is being torn apart by the monster in an instant. I raised my eyebrows at the 2 of them, my expression calm. "If you still don't understand, I can explain it in more detail." The dreadlocked man turned pale and turned his head away without saying a word. The man in the suit was about to say something, but suddenly his eyes widened in horror, and he looked forward and closed his mouth tightly. The shadow that was far away a second ago suddenly appeared in front of him. Judging by the position, it should be standing at the front of the carriage. The players finally saw the true face of the monster. It stood upright, over 4 meters tall, with a robust body. Its whole body was a bluish-gray color, covered with a layer of hard scales. From the gaps in the scales, a dark green mucus was constantly seeping out. When the mucus dripped onto the ground immediately sizzled and produced black smoke. The smoke continued to rise upwards. I looked along and saw the monster's face. It couldn't even be described as a face. A huge mouth occupied half of its face. Inside were many fine, wriggling black tentacles. Its eyeballs bulged, but the eyelids were extremely sturdy and did not reveal any white of the eyes. The eyelids were full of cracks, and as the monster's head swayed, a viscous fluid kept dripping down. The fluid flowed into the mouth, burning the tentacles, causing them to constantly divide and regenerate. This scene was so horrifying that it made one nauseous. All the players were forcefully suppressing the physiological reaction to vomit, but not everyone could hold it back. A middle-aged woman could no longer control herself and bent over to vomit on the ground. Everyone stiffened because at the moment the middle-aged woman made a sound, the monster rushed to her at an extremely fast speed, lowered its head, opened its mouth, and countless wriggling tentacles instantly extended out, densely covering the woman's entire body and hoisting her up. "Let go. I beg you. My child is still waiting for me to go home," the middle-aged woman cried in despair, kicking her legs in vain, but to no avail. The monster did not hesitate at all, and the tentacles instantly retracted, completely bringing her into its mouth. After a scream, the middle-aged woman's voice disappeared, replaced by a hair-raising chewing sound. In the extremely quiet space, the chewing sound was infinitely amplified. One could clearly hear the sound of flesh being ground, bones being chewed, and even the sound of internal organs bursting. Some people were so scared that they could hardly stand, but because they didn't dare to make a sound, they had to brace themselves hard. Suddenly, A smell of urine wafted through the air. I turned around and saw a bald, middle-aged man who had wet his pants out of fear. No one mocked him, not even the dreadlocked man. In the face of this gluttonous feast, most people's fragile nerves were on the verge of collapse. A few minutes later, the monster finally finished its meal. The position of the middle-aged woman was right behind the dreadlocked man. The monster walked 2 steps forward and stood in front of him. The dreadlocked man adapted quickly. Although his body was still a bit tense, his complexion had returned to normal. He did not show any fear in the face of the colossal creature, and there was even a hint of excitement in his eyes. It was clear on his face, "As long as I don't make a sound, you won't find me." Everyone else thought the same. However, to the player's surprise, the monster discovered the dreadlocked man. It opened its mouth wide, extended its tentacles, waved them in the air twice, and then lowered its head sharply, binding the dreadlocked man into its mouth in the same way, without any hesitation. Even the dreadlocked man himself wasn't able to react. The scream only rang out once, and then there was no sound. My heart was suddenly filled with shock. He obviously didn't speak, didn't panic and run away, didn't make any footsteps, and didn't hit anything. Why was he discovered? Before I could figure out the reason, the monster suddenly stood in front of me. Its mouth slowly opened, and countless tentacles were still tearing and digesting the remains of the dreadlocked man inside. If I didn't know why he was discovered, the one being torn apart by the tentacles in a moment would be me. The strong desire to survive made my brain spin at high speed. In a flash, a word filled my mind: breathing. Yes, it was the sound of breathing. That damn doll. It only said that the monster's hearing was keen, but it didn't say it was so keen that it could even hear the sound of breathing. This was the real difficulty of the game. I didn't have time to curse the doll's wickedness, and hurriedly held my breath to avoid being discovered by the monster. Seeing me covering my mouth and nose, the other players quickly caught on and did the same. Indeed, after holding our breath, the monster stopped expanding its mouth. However, it didn't move and didn't seem to want to leave. But my lung capacity was limited. If I didn't find a way to lead it away, I would eventually run out of breath and become its food. My brain was working frantically, but I was out of strategies. Time ticked away, my lungs constantly contracted, and the pain was unbearable. The oxygen stored in my lungs would soon be exhausted. I bit my mouth hard, and the blood seeping out moistened my tongue. The pain kept me awake, but this was not a solution. In another 10 seconds, I wouldn't be able to hold on any longer. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted the high school girl. She was looking at me with a pale face, full of panic. In a situation where the way out was unknown, nobody wanted any player to die. But what I was looking at was not her face, but the phone hanging around her neck. As her body trembled slightly, her phone also shook. I quickly took out the spare phone from my pocket, opened the music app, pressed the play button, and without any hesitation, threw it towards the area of the carriage where no one was. The moment the phone hit the ground, the sound of music suddenly rang out. At the same time, the monster quickly turned its head and rushed towards it. The numerous fine tentacles wrapped around the phone. It worked. I let out a sigh of relief, only to realize that my back was already drenched with cold sweat. The other players also showed signs of relief. As long as they followed suit, they could temporarily escape from the monster. But this was not a foolproof plan. The number of phones was limited. We couldn't keep leading the monster away forever. When all the phones were used up, we would still be trapped. Moreover, even the act of throwing the phone was not foolproof. Several players were too nervous, and the sound of music started before they even threw their phones. Unsurprisingly, they became the monster's meal. I started to recall the doll's words. The villagers need to escape from the monster's pursuit and safely return home to survive. This game actually has 2 tasks. The first is to survive from the monster's mouth. I have temporarily accomplished this. The second task is to go home. Only by going home can this game be successfully ended. But how to go home? According to the environment, we should go into the houses in the village. There must be villagers' homes there. But everything in front of us is an illusion. We can't get out of the subway carriage, so naturally we can't enter the house. What exactly is the so-called home? To go home, to enter the house, to open the door. That's right. If you want to go home, you first need to have a key. I started to take a closer look at the carriage, trying to find a key. I don't know if this train of thought is correct, but I can only give it a try. Seeing me start to act, the other players cast exploratory glances at me. I took out another phone and typed a line, "Find keys or similar items to go home." The players immediately understood my meaning and started to search carefully. Time passed second by second. We had to search carefully and couldn't make any noise. Everyone was sweating profusely. During this period, the monster swallowed several more phones. In the end, only the high school girl still had one. A player tried to throw a shoe just now, but this kind of object can't make a continuous sound. It can only attract the monster's attention for a moment. It's not very useful. According to the speed of the monster's eating, we only have 1 minute left. I pursed my lips. My hands never stopped groping around. There's no use in being nervous or scared. If you want to live, you have to speed up your actions. Faster, faster. Suddenly, music sounded from a distance, followed by the monster's roar. I looked up in a panic and saw the pale face of the high school girl. Her hand was still in the position of throwing the phone. No, I can't panic. After steadying my breath, I quickly turned my head back and continued to search. The sweat from my forehead flowed into my eyes, stinging painfully, but I didn't care to wipe it. The sound of music disappeared, and the chewing sound also disappeared. The monster had finished eating and was about to come looking again. Despair spread in the silence. The bald man who had wet his pants even gave up searching and sat on the ground. The air around me suddenly became still, and every cell in my body was screaming with the instinct to survive. Ignoring the warnings, I slowly raised my head and saw the monster standing to my right, its tentacles greedily reaching out in search of its next meal. I harshly wiped my eyes and suddenly noticed a stalk of rice under my feet. Although the scenery in the village was an illusion, what we were stepping on was a real rice field, or at least it felt like it. I bent down to take a closer look at this stalk of rice. Compared with the other stalks, it was different. Its stem was thicker, and its flowers were rounder. The heart of one of the flowers was glittering, but because the rice itself was golden, it was difficult to see unless you looked closely. Holding my breath, I reached out for this stalk of rice. The moment I picked it, the rice suddenly emitted a bright light and quickly turned into a key. Ding dong! Congratulations to the villager David for finding the way home. The game is successfully cleared. 7 villagers survive in this game, 5 villagers die. The clearance rating is B. You will have a rest time of 10 minutes. The second game will start after 10 minutes. During the rest period, players can move freely, and any behavior will not be punished. As the electronic announcement sounded, darkness enveloped me again. When the light returned, the illusion and the monster had disappeared, and the real subway carriage appeared in front of me again. Everyone was looking at me, with both fear and gratitude in their eyes. After an awkward silence, the man in the suit came over, smiled, and said, "You're David, right? We really owe you one. Without you, we might not have survived." The curve of his smile was just right, but he couldn't hide the jealousy in his eyes. He was resentful that I had stolen his thunder. Ignoring his smile, I responded coldly, "I was just protecting myself. I didn't intend to help any of you." The smile on his face cracked in an instant as his face filled with rage. He began to incessantly criticize, saying I was arrogant, impolite, too presumptuous. The familiar words drilled into my ears, resurfacing again and again. It wasn't just one person who said this. From childhood till now, I've heard many times from psychologists that my mental state is fine, but I was born with an emotional deficiency. Not having developed an antisocial personality is already something to be grateful for. I don't demand more from myself, so why should others dictate how I should be? So, I didn't pay attention to a single word the man in the suit said, but her incessant chatter was giving me a headache. Finally, when my patience was exhausted, I said irritably, "With all this spare time you have to criticize me so extensively, you must have already figured out the content of the next round." The man in the suit paused, clearly not having caught on. "The second round hasn't been announced yet. What is there to think about?" I gave a cold laugh. He loves to show off, loves to be the center of attention, and loves to play the role of a leader in the early stages of the game. That's why me passing the first round successfully and, in front of everyone, not responding to his kindness, caused him to lose his composure. But what's most annoying about him is that he's oblivious to his stupidity. The order of the first game was to announce the rules, provide rest time, and then start the game. If we follow this order, the doll should have first announced the theme and rules of the second round, then provided rest time, and the game would start right after the rest time. But now, he has disrupted the order. Why? The only explanation I can think of is that the doll is trying to avoid excessive communication between the players. Announcing the rules too early might allow the players to discuss strategies to pass the round in advance. If my guess is correct, the next game must be related to information. I looked around at the surviving players in the subway. There was the arrogant man in the suit, the agreeable female student, the cowardly bald man, a couple who had always been inconspicuous, and a primary school student. They didn't inspire any desire to communicate at all. After 10 minutes, the electronic voice of the doll sounded on time. Rest time is over. Now announcing the content of the second round. The theme of the game is the monster's revenge. Game introduction. Unable to eat all the villagers, the monster is furious and decides to take revenge. He sneaks into one of the villagers while they are not paying attention, hiding among the villagers, planning to wipe them all out in one fell swoop. Game rules. The monster is hiding among the villagers, and the players need to collectively find him. After the game starts, each player will receive a knife. Stabbing the knife into the monster's heart is considered a successful clearance. Please note that the game time is 30 minutes. If time is exceeded, the game will be deemed a failure. Villagers may not kill each other. If you stab your own kind with a knife, it will be considered a failure for the individual. Find the monster hiding among you. Good luck, everyone. Before the doll could finish speaking, I suddenly interrupted. This isn't fair, is it? The calm face of the doll in the electronic screen suddenly became fierce, the red light in its eyes growing stronger, filled with a bloodthirsty excitement. During game announcements, noise will be treated as a violation. Did this player forget? I nodded and calmly said, I didn't forget, but I was the one who found the key and passed the last round. The only reward I received was a 10-minute rest for everyone. I didn't get any personal reward. That's not fair, is it? As the executor of the game rules, I have the right to question your negligence. Is there a way to report this? The doll's expression froze, its mouth still open in a smile. The electronic screen suddenly turned into snowflakes. A few seconds later, the doll reappeared, its terrifying face returning to calm. Hello, player David. The first round was a collective victory, so there are no individual rewards set up in the game. The game rules are not flawed. However, it was detected that you performed outstandingly during the game, so I can give you a chance to ask a question. I will answer any question. Do you want to use your question opportunity now? The red light in his eyes dimmed, and his big mouth returned to normal. If you ignore the large, eye-catching doll, he looks no different from ordinary dolls. He seemed to be deliberately pretending to be gentle, but I could hear his reluctance in his voice, gritting his teeth, wishing he could tear me apart the next second. Ignoring his head, I bluntly took the opportunity to ask, in the second round of the game, the player's goal is to find the monster. What is the monster's goal? Is it to eat people during the game, or to survive until the end? The doll sneered, showing a sinister smile. The monster's goal is to survive until the end of the game. As a reward, all players will become its food. In other words, the monster should not actively attack people during the game, as this would easily expose its identity and cause it to fail the game. It seems I don't need to worry about the risk of being attacked by the monster during the game. My answer is over. Are you satisfied, player David? I nodded and grinned. I have no more questions. Let's start the second round of the game. I'm eager to go home. Just then, the doll's gentle mask suddenly broke, and his face turned back into a cruel and bloodthirsty terror. His mouth opened wide, and he said excitedly, "Don't rush. Your reward has been calculated. Now we're going to carry out the punishment for your noise during my game announcement." As soon as his words fell, a red line suddenly appeared around my neck. Accompanied by an intense burning sensation, the red line gradually tightened, as if it was about to sever my head. Through the electronic screen, I carefully observed the doll's replica, filled with greed and anticipation. I felt as though I could already see my body being drained in an instant by the red flower, turning into a wrinkled skin bag. You must be mistaken. I didn't violate any rules, I stated calmly. The tightening red line around my neck halted, and the doll's voice became sharp and piercing. I clearly heard you, it protested. You're mistaken, I meticulously recollected. I only spoke after you finished announcing the game rules. You should have surveillance footage. You can review it. When I spoke, you were wishing everyone good luck. That doesn't fall under announcing game rules. At most, it's casual chatting. The doll seemed to choke again, probably truly annoyed by me. The red line around my neck would tighten and loosen, but it did not sever my head. After a while, it simply ignored me and stated sulkily, "The second game officially begins." A countdown of 30:00 appeared on the screen. However, this time the players did not experience any illusions. Perhaps my conversation with the doll was too explosive. The rest of the players were staring at me, seemingly with a lot of questions but not daring to voice them. The man in the suit coughed and took the lead in the game again. The game rules require us to find the monster. I suggest everyone share their situation. Perhaps we can find clues from language loopholes. He glanced at me apprehensively. Player David, why don't you start? I played with the dagger that suddenly appeared in my hand, experimenting with the angle of grip. Without lifting my head, I said, "You guys chat. I have nothing to say." His face crumpled in an instant, anger flaring up again. He asked harshly, "How could you do this? It's obvious that this round of the game requires team cooperation to pass. You're not cooperating. Aren't you the one possessed by the monster?" When people are uneasy, even a random suspicion can be very damaging. Even though his words were baseless, the high school girl who was sitting directly opposite me moved a few inches to the left. The bald man sitting to my left, who was only 1 seat away from me, was wiping the sweat from his forehead, looking at a loss. But the dagger in his other hand was pointed directly at me. Even the 10-year-old primary school student, who had always been inconspicuous, looked at me with hostility. I glanced at the man in the suit indifferently. "If you suspect that I'm the monster, why don't you take action? You're afraid to do it because you're afraid you might be wrong. But I've been too outstanding, and you can't put your mind at ease. Why not just say it out loud? Incite others to kill me, right?" His face turned a shade paler, his expression clearly showing that I had hit the nail on the head. I had always thought he was a fool, but I didn't expect him to be shrewd when it came to his life. I didn't say the rest, but anyone with a bit of brains could guess. If someone really kills me, and I'm the monster player, they can successfully pass. If I'm not the monster, the person who kills me will be punished, eliminated. The number of suspects would immediately decrease by 2, greatly reducing the difficulty of the game. No matter what, it's very beneficial for the suit man. Seeing the change in the other's eyes towards him, he licked his chapped lips and yelled irritably, "What can I do? I don't want to die. If you have no solution, find the monster. What's the use of blaming me?" He doesn't want to die, so he incites others to take risks. This kind of bandit logic, I'm surprised he can say it out loud. I sneered and turned my head away, refusing to look at him any longer. One more glance would only infuriate me. The pressing matter at hand was not moral condemnation, but finding the monster. Otherwise, when the countdown ended, everyone would die. Eventually, the players roughly shared their situations, including their professions, family information, and where they were headed on the subway today, among other things. However, there was no discrepancy in anyone's story. After a long scrutiny, everyone's face was filled with despair. The situation was at a standstill. Suddenly, the 10-year-old boy who had been inconspicuous from the start had watery eyes and asked the woman of the couple if he could hug her. The woman, dressed in a floral sundress and with a gentle voice, was a kindergarten teacher. She hesitated for a moment, but despite her own fear, she reached out and hugged the boy, comforting him. "Don't be afraid. We'll get out of here." However, the gentle voice suddenly changed its tune. She pushed the little boy away abruptly, her face filled with the panic of being humiliated. The boy rubbed his hands, and had a lewd smile on his face that was extremely incongruous with his age. "What's wrong with me touching you?" he asked. "You're dressed so provocatively. Isn't it because you want to be touched?" Everyone was shocked by his words. Even the woman's boyfriend didn't react. The boy, however, rolled his eyes nonchalantly. "I never expected to survive anyway. Can't I touch a woman before I die?" He suddenly leaned forward towards the woman, took a deep sniff, and said, "I used to have to peek at you in the toilet, but today I finally got to touch you. You feel so good, and you smell nice too." The woman in the long skirt held her chest tightly and recoiled, crying out, "How can you be so shameless?" With a smack, the little boy's face twisted to one side, clearly showing the imprint of 5 fingers. The woman's boyfriend was so angry that his face turned red. Not satisfied with just a slap, he grabbed the boy's shirt collar and threw him hard on the ground. "You behave like an animal at such a young age. If your parents didn't teach you, I will." He was about to pounce on the boy and hit him again when the boy suddenly pulled out a dagger and waved it in front of his chest, shouting arrogantly, "If you dare, come here. I'll stab you and we'll die together. I never planned to survive anyway. I'll take someone down with me." The woman's crying, her boyfriend's cursing, and the filthy language spewing from the boy's mouth all mixed together, creating a noisy chaos that resembled a vegetable market. I rubbed my ears and was about to call a stop when the woman's scream filled the subway car. Her boyfriend looked down in disbelief to see a dagger firmly lodged in his chest. The other end of the dagger was still firmly held in the little boy's hand. The chubby 10-year-old boy, who looked like a ball and was covered in fat, sneered and pushed the dagger in deeper, his voice filled with unrestrained malice. "Why do you get to live so long and have such a pretty girlfriend, while I have to die before I even grow up? Go to hell. We haven't found the monster yet, so I'm sure I won't survive. You don't want to live either. Let's die together." There's no age for a demon, no distinction between old and young. The man's pupils gradually dilated, and the bloodstain on his chest grew larger, forming a bright red flower. I had seen this flower on many people's necks before. His flesh and blood were rapidly drained. At the same time, the little boy's head exploded like a firework. In the blink of an eye, 2 living people were reduced to 2 empty skins. The woman in the long skirt cried out in horror and desperately reached for the human skin, wanting to hold it in her arms. The man in the suit quickly pulled her away, his face full of gloom. "What's the use of crying when the person is already dead? It's better to find the monster and escape from this ghost place." She looked dazed for a moment, murmuring, "He is dead. He died because of me. I don't want to live anymore." The man in the suit said callously, "If you don't want to live, go ahead and die. It's another option for the monster to be eliminated." Overwhelmed by grief, the woman didn't catch the sarcasm in his words. She really picked up the dagger and slowly aimed it at her heart. "Excuse me," I interrupted, pointing at the man in the suit. "Since you don't want to live, why not kill him too? This way, we can eliminate 2 options at once and have a better chance of winning." The man in the suit stared at me in astonishment, too surprised to say a word. But his gaze was clearly asking, "How can you be even more shameless than me?" I grinned. "I've been annoyed with you for a long time. If I don't sabotage you now, then when?" My interruption seemed to snap the woman out of her suicidal thoughts. She silently wiped away her tears and retreated into a corner without a word. The countdown on the electronic screen was already down to the last 3 minutes. Besides the death of 2 human players, the game had made no progress. The man in the suit finally lost his composure and frantically questioned who the monster was. The high school girl cried out in grief, her shoulders trembling, and the dagger in her hand flipping around. I glanced at the bald man next to me and asked, "If we can't find the monster within 3 minutes, we're going to die. Aren't you scared?" The bald man had a bitter look on his face, forcing a bitter smile. "What's the use of being scared? I'm already prepared to die." I gave him a meaningful look and sincerely praised, "You were so scared that you wet your pants in the last round of the game, but now you can face death calmly. You accepted it very quickly." "What do you mean by that?" The bald man frowned, looking a bit uncomfortable. "What I mean is, I quickly reached out with the hand holding the dagger and accurately stabbed it into his heart. With a soft thud, the blade sank into the flesh. I gave a gloomy smile. I'm very curious when you crawled into this man's body. Instead of a red flower, countless writhing tentacles sprouted from his chest. Not only his chest, these tentacles emerged from the bald man's eyes, nostrils, mouth, and ears, devouring his flesh from the outside in. In just a few seconds, the bald man was consumed, leaving nothing but bones. The countdown stopped at 0.59 minutes. The electronic screen flickered a few times, and the face of the doll appeared again. Congratulations to player David for successfully finding the hidden monster. The second round of the game was successfully cleared. The pass rating is a grade. Break time is 10 minutes. This time, his electronic voice was devoid of any emotion. After saying these two sentences, it disappeared, as if it didn't want to stay for even a second. How did you know? The man in the suit wiped his face, looking at me as if he had seen a ghost. Actually, it's very simple. From the start of the second game, I've been paying attention to whether the other people had any abnormalities. There were no flaws when each one introduced their information, which was within my expectations. If the monster could possess, it's very likely that it could extract the host's memory. So, all my attention was on their external behavior. At first, I suspected the 10-year-old boy. After all, it's not wise to approach any player when the monster is unknown. But the results proved that both he and the man who died at his hands were normal humans. The scope instantly narrowed down to 4 people: the high school girl, the woman in the long skirt, the suit man, and the bald man. The first one to be ruled out was the suit man, because from the beginning, he wanted to incite other players to kill each other. When a player dies during this round of the game, their flesh and blood would be drained by the red flowers, and they would not become food for the monster. This is contrary to the monster's goal of devouring everyone in the end. The remaining 3 people didn't do anything out of the ordinary. But the problem was exactly here. In the first round of the game, when the monster devoured other players, the bald man wet his pants out of fear, clearly showing that his psychological endurance was very poor. But in this round of the game, every time I looked at him secretly, he was very calm, as if everything happening in the carriage had nothing to do with him. Even when the usually composed man in the suit was on the verge of a breakdown, he didn't say anything. But when the suit man suspected me, he was able to display hostility very cooperatively. If no one talked to him, he could quickly switch to a face of fear and despair, which clearly showed that he was trying to appear normal. The range of suspicion was originally only 3 people. Even if there was not a 100% certainty, the abnormality of the bald man was enough for me to stab him with the knife. Rather than sitting and waiting for death, it's better to follow intuition and make a choice. Fortunately, I guessed right. Ignoring the cold sweat and goosebumps on my body, I took a deep breath, which then allowed my pounding heart to calm down. The high school girl lowered her head to thank me and apologized for her previous suspicion of me. The woman in the long skirt, who had lost her lover, still sat blankly, not reacting to anything in front of her. The suit man seemed to have finally had enough of me. His face puffed up, and he didn't say anything after pouting. Suddenly, the door of the subway car opened. As the car door opened wide, the doll appeared again. Congratulations to the 4 players who have survived to this point. I have provided a rest area for you. Please move to the uniform area to rest fully before going home. The game is over. The suit man breathed a sigh of relief and, without any hesitation, was the first one to leave the carriage. As if he were afraid that the door would close despite my hesitation, I followed them. After exiting the subway station via the escalator, the scene in front of us shocked everyone. A never-ending night with heavy snowfall, the snow piled thick on the ground. When you stepped on it, your entire lower leg was almost buried. What's worse, the temperature outside was extremely low, probably around -40 degrees. The 4 of us were all dressed in summer clothes. If we didn't find a warm place soon, we would freeze to death here. Do you see that building ahead? Is it the service area mentioned by the doll? The high school girl suddenly pointed to the distance and said excitedly. I followed her hand and saw a red and white 2-story building at the end of the wide road. There were 2 street lamps on both sides of the building. The warm yellow light was very gentle in the harsh white snow. The exterior wall of the house was cream white, and a huge red sign hung above the door. The words, "Welcome," were very eye-catching. As we approached, we could clearly see the figures inside through the large transparent floor-to-ceiling windows. Men and women in elegant clothes were sitting at several dining tables, eating happily. Everyone had a satisfied smile on their face. Appropriately dressed waiters were rotating among them with trays, serving food and wine, and responding to every need with enthusiasm. The aroma of the delicious food and wine in the house seemed to have already floated into my nostrils. "Let's go in. There must be a lot of delicious food inside." The high school girl rubbed her frozen shoulders, her eyes full of longing. The suit man walked straight over. The woman in the long skirt couldn't stand the cold and also ran to catch up. I was a bit hesitant. On such a cold, snowy day, such a warm house was like a haven in the apocalypse. Every part of it was attracting people to come in. It was too tempting, almost like a sweet danger. "Let's go in, or we'll freeze to death," the high school girl kept urging. I gritted my teeth and followed her. She was right. I had no choice. I had to go in. The house was indeed warm inside. As soon as I stepped in, I could feel my nearly frozen blood quickly returning to normal. The soothing sound of piano music was calming my nerves, which had been on edge all the way. The cream-white European-style tables and chairs were both retro and luxurious. The crystal chandelier in the center of the room was dazzlingly bright. After going through so many dangers, this place was like a paradise. "Welcome," for guests. "What would you like to order?" A man in a tailcoat came over with a smile and handed over the menu. The menu was filled with everything from exotic delicacies to street food, including various national dishes. The variety was very rich. However, the prices were not in dollars, but in points. "What are these points?" The suit man pointed to the prices and asked with confusion. The waiter, with an appropriate smile on his face, answered, "Points can be exchanged for dollars at a ratio of 1 to 10 million. A few dollars can be exchanged for 10,000 points." "So cheap?" the high school girl exclaimed. "A lobster for 7,800 points is less than $1 after conversion. Our aim is to provide guests with a homely service. The prices are absolutely affordable and low, and will not make guests feel uncomfortable," the waiter said proudly. "I'll have a Wellington steak." The man in the suit licked his lips, his eyes shining with anticipation. "I'll have a Boston lobster with cream soup." The high school girl also hurriedly placed her order. Even the woman in the long skirt, who had been immersed in grief and hadn't said much, ordered a bowl of crab roe noodles. "Sir, what would you like to eat?" The waiter, with a smile at the corner of his mouth, recorded the orders of the 3 people and then turned to ask me. "I'm not hungry. I don't want to eat anything," I flatly refused. The house that appeared out of nowhere in the heavy snow was strange enough. The various dishes, with prices so low that they were almost non-existent, made people dare not think carefully. Are these cheap dishes really made from fresh ingredients? If not, then what is the raw material? However, I didn't expect that as soon as I refused, the smile on the waiter's face fell. His eyes immediately turned cold as he stared at me. "No, that's not possible. Every customer that enters our restaurant must order." "You cannot refuse. Sir, what would you like to eat?" he repeated one more time. I was sure that if I refused again, I would either be kicked out or face a scarier consequence. After sighing, I braced myself and carefully looked at the menu. Every dish was glossy and looked very appetizing. Moreover, the prices were very low. But the cheaper they were, the less I dared to order. I was slowly flipping through the not-so-thick booklet, and the waiter patiently stood aside, showing no signs of leaving. Suddenly, my gaze stopped on a picture. It was a very inconspicuous picture. Amidst the dazzling menu, it was placed in the corner of an inner page. The picture showed a bowl of white rice, plain and bland, without any embellishments. Compared with the pictures of exotic delicacies around it, it was completely out of place. But the price attracted me because this ordinary bowl of white rice actually cost 990 W points to exchange, which was equivalent to $990. Without blinking, I quickly pointed to the white rice and said, "I'll have this." The waiter was taken aback, forced a smile, and said, "Sir, the white rice is the worst value for money food here. Are you sure you want to order it?" "Yes," I replied without any hesitation. Seeing that he couldn't persuade me, the waiter didn't continue to argue. He quickly recorded it on paper and said, "Please find a seat anywhere. The food will be served soon." And indeed, the food was served quickly. I sat alone in the corner, holding a bowl of white rice. I looked up to see the other 3 players not far away, burying their heads in the dishes on their plates. Their faces were full of iron and greed, exactly the same as the other guests in this room. "Guest, aren't you going to eat?" The waiter popped out of nowhere, looked at me solemnly, and said, "Wasting food will be punished. Guests must finish their meals." I couldn't refuse, so I had to randomly put the rice into my mouth. The taste and texture were no different from the rice I had eaten before, but I felt a bit uneasy. Suddenly, I was shocked to see that the food in the plates of the suit man and the others had changed. The carefully cooked meat was rotting and turning black at a very fast speed. Within a short time, it started to smell. Countless white maggots were floating on the dark brown soup, but the 3 of them didn't notice at all. They continued to gobble up the food. The rotten meat filled their mouths and even stuck to their faces. However, their eating movements did not slow down at all, but even seemed to speed up. Their bellies quickly swelled up and became bigger and bigger. Finally, they broke through a certain threshold, and with a bang, all 3 of them exploded. But they still kept eating the food on the plate. Once they had finished, they frantically searched around and finally fished out undigested food from the exploded stomachs and continued to stuff it into their mouths. It was as if they would never be full and would never stop. I endured the feeling of nausea and watched this scene. Suddenly I thought of something and quickly looked down at the bowl in front of me. The plain white rice was still the same, without any change. I breathed a sigh of relief. If I didn't guess wrong, the reason why those dishes were cheap was because they were all made from the flesh and blood of dead players. The red flowers were likely storage devices for flesh and blood. This kind of meat has no cost, so naturally, there is no need to sell it at a high price. On the other hand, because white rice is real rice, and the waiter intentionally discourages players from ordering it, the price is actually expensive. When I looked up, the scene around me had completely changed. The magnificent 2-story building had turned into a dilapidated ruin, and the white long table in front of me had turned into a bloody stainless steel-cased table. The pleasant piano sound had disappeared, replaced by the familiar and chilling sound of flesh and blood being crushed. The guests who used to be dressed in fancy clothes, including the 3 men in suits, had all turned into skeletons with remnants of flesh. "Why aren't you eating anymore? Is the food not to your taste?" A skull suddenly appeared in front of me, its eyeless black holes staring straight at me. I took a deep breath and steadied my voice. "I'm full. Can you pack the rest for me to take away?" The skull laughed, and flesh gradually grew on its face, turning it into a doll. The doll's eyes glowed red, and it said in a familiar electronic voice, "Congratulations to player David. You have passed the hidden level, the last carnival. Your clearance level is A. The game reward is going home." As its words fell, my vision went black and I fainted. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on a hospital bed, the smell of disinfectant filling my nostrils. I later learned from the news that the subway I was on had a major accident. Of the 132 people on the entire train, only I survived. But as for the truth of what happened, I fear only I know. After a month of recovery, my body was completely healed. One day, as I was about to go through the discharge procedures, a delivery man ran in and handed me a bag, saying it was my takeaway. But I hadn't ordered anything. Confused, I opened the bag and my hand froze in midair. Inside the bag was a bowl of rice, with a small indent in it, as if someone had taken 2 bites. At that moment, my phone suddenly received a text message. "Hello, player David. It has been detected that you have successfully cleared the subway escape game and your body is recovering well. You are invited to participate in the next game in a month. The time and place will be notified separately. Note: unless the invited person dies accidentally, this invitation cannot be refused."